Welcome back to the Mindful Healthcare Summit. I'm Eve Ekman, Director of Training at the Greater Good Science Center, and delighted to be here with you. We're going to go through a series of ideas and short practices that I think you'll find beneficial immediately. You'll be able to use them while we're here together and able to use them when you get home and when you get back to work with your colleagues. To give you a brief overview, I want to just let you know what we'll be covering. I'm going to be talking about empathy and its relationship to compassion and burnout. I know burnout is a theme you hear a lot about, that there's been so much coverage and research in many hospitals and clinic settings. There's lunchtime lectures, and there's already a lot of discussion. I will just briefly cover burnout and really describe why it's important to understand the relationship between burnout and empathy and how that could actually lead to compassion, not only with ourselves, but of course with our patients and colleagues. I'll then talk about emotion mapping, looking at these universal experiences of emotion and how we can learn to understand them to both help us manage stress, as well as have empathy that really does facilitate that compassion. This will also lead into a discussion of some emotion tracking studies I've done in the healthcare setting, primarily with residents, and looking at what are their day-to-day emotion experiences, how can they be understood and thereby targeted for interventions that are truly meaningful. In some ways, we know a lot about burnout, but we know only a tiny bit about what causes burnout. What are the actual day-to-day emotional experiences we can address to help people cope? I will also talk about some interventions I've done in the hospital, focusing on supporting provider resilience by upping compassion and empathy. And that training is called SPRUCE. So supporting provider resilience by upping compassion and empathy. That's an acronym. At UCSF, we really prided ourselves on our clever, steady acronyms. So that's one I'll share with you. And I will also talk about some of the work we've done at the Greater Good Science Center to make readily available here and now practices from positive psychology that can improve your day-to-day work life in terms of meaning and purpose through the simple act of gratitude. So that's what we'll be getting into. And I'd like us to actually start by doing something quite simple, which is just taking a moment to set an intention. You can do this simply by continuing to look at the screen or having your eyes softly closed, or just focused a little bit more downward. This closing of the eyes or focus downward can help us look inward. This very brief practice of intention setting is one I really encourage that people do every day. Not something you do once, like my intention is to be a great nurse or great social worker, but my intention today is to show up with kindness. My intention today is to bring a quality of real presence or listening. So let's take a moment with this soft focus or even eyes closed. And first check in on the physical body. What does it feel like in your body right now? Is there tension and tightness? Is there ease? Is there fatigue? Is there energy? So taking a moment to bring the attention and focus inward to just notice the experience of the body right now. And now taking a moment to include the mind. What is the quality of the mind right now? Are there many thoughts or few? Might there be some emotional residue from something that happened earlier in the day or something we anticipate later? And from this noticing, from paying attention to what our body, our mind, our heart is experiencing, set an intention from here. A simple sentence or even a word. For the rest of the day, my intention is. Repeat it silently to yourself a couple times. It doesn't have to be the perfect one or the right one. It's just what is working right now. And gently, if your eyes were closed, blinking them back open. and otherwise just returning to attention and awareness here. This simple practice of setting our intention can be quite powerful. It can help us throughout the day. So it's very easy to feel that sense of meaning and purpose and connection when we're doing direct client work. We feel good, we're getting good response, or we're with our colleagues sharing ideas. However, when we are doing the dreaded paperwork or some of the other tasks that are just mundane, we can lose a sense of purpose, and our overall view of what we're doing can feel meaningless, and that actually creates its own sense of stress. So to really imbue whatever we're doing with a quality of intention and purpose that's relevant for us is actually a really simple and powerful technique. So we'll move on now, and I just want to give you a little sense of who I am and why I'm speaking with you. I am the Director of Training at the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. And our dedication is to bring the most cutting edge science from positive psychology and neuroscience of meaning, purpose, gratitude, altruism, and how we can translate that into our everyday life. So I have a website, we have an online magazine, we have many practices, and I'll be sharing one with you at the end that you can use specifically in the practice of medicine. I spent 6 years as a medical social worker at San Francisco General Hospital in the emergency room. It's a level 1 trauma center. It was a great education working there and really inspired me, not only because it was absolutely an enormous source of meaning in my everyday life, but it also inspired me because there was so much room to learn more about what would help care providers. How do we really support a compassion that's sustainable over time? So I went back to school and did my doctorate degree at Berkeley, focusing on the sustaining of compassion specifically for care providers. I then went to the UCSF Osher Center for Integrative Medicine and did postdoctoral training where I was able to adapt mindfulness-based and compassion-based interventions to use with residents. And residents are an awesome population because they're so hard to work with. They are totally underslept, always being evaluated, so they're stressed out, and everything they're doing is new. There's an enormous amount of fear, anxiety, and insecurity if they're doing it right. So I was able to translate some practices for them that I will also share with you. And one other project I've gotten to work on that I'll share with you as well is a Atlas of Emotion. And this was a project I collaborated on with my father, who's an emotion scientist named Paul Ekman, and a design company here based in San Francisco. This was a project that the Dalai Lama asked for us to create in order to have an atlas or map of our emotions. Having an atlas or map provides a language, some way to describe and understand what's happening to us so we can avoid succumbing to feelings of rumination and overwhelm and have a calm mind in which we can choose more clearly how we'd like to respond. This also relates to cultivating emotional balance, a training I've been leading for the last 10 years, in which we bring the best from Western psychology and Eastern contemplative science, specifically on managing destructive emotions. So I'm really looking forward to sharing with you a bit from my history and background in all these practices, especially into healthcare. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by talking with you about burnout. Now, of course, you all know the term burnout, but some of you may not know the specifics of what burnout actually measures. So Christina Maslach, who I was fortunate to have on my dissertation committee, designed the burnout scale in the 70s. And the way she did so was not by thinking what makes people stressed out. What she did was interview hundreds of people, and not about acute stress, like what is it like to have a hard day, but what is it like to have chronic, ongoing stress? Every day, that drain, that feeling of overwhelm. And when she looked at these interviews, what she found was that there was 3 main domains of this kind of burnout-related stress. The first domain is called emotional exhaustion. This really describes that feeling at the end of the day where you have been seeing patients and in some ways not able to express how you really feel. You're doing what's called an emotion labor. You're over-amplifying the good, I'm really happy, everything's great, and you're suppressing in a lot of ways what's hard, your feelings of fear and anxiety, sadness, wondering if you can actually help these people. So this end of the day feeling of having practiced a lot of emotional labor can be quite exhausting. And when you look at the majority of studies that are reporting on burnout in healthcare, they're reporting on that emotional exhaustion. The exhaustion itself can be pretty well addressed, by having time to take care of ourselves. I know that at this point in the healthcare world, especially in the training world, self-care can be considered a bit of a almost a four-letter word. People are really tired of hearing how they need to take the responsibility to help or change themselves instead of the entire healthcare institution doing what's needed and required to give people more time to recover and to recuperate. So as I say, it's important to have this time. I'm aware it can be really difficult to access it. So we have emotional exhaustion as this first level of burnout. The second level of burnout is what's called a lack of efficacy. And it really impedes our sense of meaning. This lack of efficacy means I can't get done what's expected of me. On a day-to-day basis, there is more to do than I can respond to. And there's more than I can do and respond to effectively. A lot of people feel this lack of efficacy around electronic medical records. I just can't keep up. And as a result, I'm not able to spend the time with my patients that I'd like. It's a different quality than being emotionally exhausted. This is one that is a little bit more of an overwhelm. We can have emotional exhaustion even when we feel pretty good. Like, wow, today was exhausting, but I really connected and it made a difference. So there's an interesting different level here, and one that makes it hard for us to feel like what we do makes a difference. Now, this third level of burnout is one that's called depersonalization or cynicism. This is when we reach the level at our work where we are not exhausted, we are not feeling lack of efficacy, we are just numb. We kind of don't care. It's just too much to tolerate the difficulty of every day, and we've just kind of put up our guard and in some ways are at a sub-stimulation level of stress. We are just checked out. And this level of cynicism, for anyone who's worked on a team, you know, it is impossible to move anything forward if even one person has this attitude. They'll be shooting down any new ideas, they aren't willing to do the work. And so this level of cynicism and depersonalization is really concerning. And it has different ways that it needs to be approached. When we think about the amount of research on burnout, there's profound amount of research, decades of research. And yet we're just beginning to understand what helps us address each of these levels. And I invite you as a healthcare provider to really investigate if you have noticed these kinds of burnout in your own experience, in your own practice. Is there different strategies or solutions that work? With depersonalization, my assumption and what I know from the literature to date is that we need to feel some sense of purpose and efficacy. I mean, we feel the depersonalization and cynicism because we can't help. So how do we get a feeling of being able to do something? And when we have that lack of efficacy and purpose, the same is true. Can we actually set our intention, as we did in the beginning, towards something more easy, something more simple? Today I want to show up and be a little more open. Or today I want to show up and really pay attention to what's happening in my body. So to set these smaller intentions or goals we can fulfill. This can be a way of really regaining that sense of capacity, of ability. So here's a little on burnout. And now I really want to connect this to empathy. And I am sharing a bit from a series of articles I've written, most recently with Michael Krasner, or Mick Krasner, who runs the Mindful Practice program out of the University of Rochester. And we wrote a piece together considering how do we include empathy and the neuroscience of empathy into medical education in a meaningful way. So I want us to start with a simple definition of empathy. And in this case, I'm going to call it a professional empathy. So not necessarily what you're feeling with your family members or your friends, but as a care provider, as someone who on an everyday basis, part of your treatment requires connecting to another person, understanding what they need, and responding. So the empathy I'm describing here is drawn from neuroscientific literature, and it has two main components. The two components include first, meaning what happens first, is an automatic affective emotional resonance. So I'll use an example. If I'm a social worker in the ER and I see a patient come in to talk with me and I see her tearful and she's crying and is clearly upset, at an almost automatic level, I am resonating to her emotional experience because of my mirror neurons, because of my physiological hardwiring head to toe to connect to and notice what's happening to others. I'm able to assess and feel with. It doesn't mean I'm having the exact same experience as her. It means that I can resonate to her emotions, her tears. So this is our first level of affective empathy. Then there is what's called cognitive appraisal, a curiosity. There's almost immediately after that emotional resonance, there's then a wondering, what's going on with this person? Why is she tearful? So those two components are empathy. There's the emotional resonance and the curiosity, the appraisal, the perspective taking. Now, this empathy can actually lead to a variety of different outcomes. And I want to walk us through three and have you reflect on if this resonates to you. We have the first kind of empathy where, for example, this woman comes in tearful to my office. I have an appraisal. What's going on with her? And in this example, I'm thinking of someone who I'd seen before. And I'd seen her before come into the ER as a result of domestic violence. And so in my appraisal, I'm wondering, wow, I wonder what's going on with her partnership. I wonder if she's safe. And so my response, after my resonance and my appraisal is, how can I be helpful to her? What is the empathic response? What is the compassionate response? When we respond compassionately with this empathic response, this doesn't necessarily mean that we are doing anything. It doesn't mean that we are trying to fix the entire situation. It could mean that we're listening with compassion. We're paying attention to what the person in front of us is telling us they need. One of the ways that empathy can lead to burnout is when we feel that everything we're being presented with is something we have to fix or do. And unfortunately, a good deal of medical education across different fields gives us this idea that we're going to train you really well, and then you're going to be able to fix and solve everything if you just work at it. And that sets us up in some ways to burn out. There's a way in which we obviously can't help everyone and everything. We can't solve poverty through our practice of medicine. We can't solve inequality through our practice of medicine. We can't solve a healthcare system through our practice of medicine. And one of the ways that we can listen compassionately is by really having and working on a belief that my compassionate listening is doing. When we believe there's something we can do, we can avoid feelings of helplessness, like I'm not making a difference. The emotional exhaustion doesn't feel as draining if we feel like what we do makes a difference. So here's one way of empathy. I see this woman and her tears. I recognize and understand what's going on for her, and I show up as she needs me. This may not be an embrace. That may not be culturally appropriate. It might not be appropriate for our relationship. It may mean that I'm giving her referrals to different domestic violence shelters or counseling. It may mean that I'm giving her some idea about boundaries and directions, but I'm really listening to what she needs. That's the compassionate response to empathy. Now, I want to give you two other examples. I could have this woman come in, see her tears, and in my appraisal, instead of it being one of, I wonder what's happening to her, I'm curious, my appraisal is one that ends up being more along the lines of distancing, and in some ways a kind of negativity. And I see her come in and I think, I know why she's here. She still hasn't left him. Last time she was here, I already gave her the referrals. She knows it's not safe. They have kids. Why is she doing this? You know what? If she really wanted help, she would do this for herself. I'm not going to work for her because she's not working for herself. Now, I'm being exaggerated here, but I think all of us can recognize this experience where our appraisal of the situation actually creates kind of aversion or blaming. And this is a lot like that cynicism level of burnout, where we just are disengaged and don't in some ways care. I wish this didn't happen, and yet, especially during my time in the ER, we have so many cases where people are coming frequently for the same problem. And it really, really challenges our empathy to keep our curiosity open of what's happening with them now. How can I empathically respond to their suffering? Yeah, maybe they aren't working hard for their own well-being. And yet because my goal is just staying compassionate, I will still work for them. So I think some people get a little caught up with compassion where there's a belief that I will be compassionate if someone is also showing up for themselves. Like I will help if they are willing to receive the help. And I get that. But as a professional, we have to help irrespective of whether or not someone's going to take it. And what I mean by that is we are trying always for their own well-being, even if they're not trying that hard. And the mindset here isn't that the more that we compassion to them, the better they'll get. The idea is, how do we continue to have a compassionate heart? How do we sustain it? How do we not succumb to those feelings of aversion and distancing? So I want you to, consider a time when there may have been this instance, and consider what were the conditions that might have led to that, of that feeling of distancing. We're going to move on now to one other form of empathy, or way that empathy can unfold. Here I have this woman come in, again, tearful. Again, I know a bit of her history. And my immediate response is of cognitive appraisal is, I can't handle this. So I had one other mentor on my dissertation committee who truly changed my life and thinking, Jody Halpern. And she wrote about this idea that when we kind of self-reference in our experience of empathy, it leads to overwhelm. We get kind of merged with this patient. We don't see the critical and important distance between what's happening to them and what's happening to us. And instead, we kind of succumb to overwhelm and despair. And of course, not only is that hard for us, it actually makes us unavailable for compassion. Though that heartfelt feeling of sadness and despair is beautiful, right? We're resonating to the sadness of domestic violence and ongoing cycles and whatever other challenges you're responding to. And we also are unavailable, or we're lost in our own difficulty. So we see here how empathy indeed can have some challenges. And what I'm really trying to emphasize here is the importance of how we move towards compassion. And I want to give us a basic schema and then talk a little bit more about moving towards compassion, or the skills of compassion, which, spoiler alert, are not about practicing everyday compassion. That is enormously important, but I think you already know that. I want to tell you more about practicing emotional awareness and how emotional awareness facilitates compassion. So at a very simple level, empathy can lead to empathic distress. It can lead to aversion, and that makes us burnt out, right? But empathic distress can also lead to compassion, to really responding in a heartfelt way. And that, not only does it lead to good patient outcomes, it leads to our work feeling meaningful, purposeful. And that's something for us to really keep in mind. I'm sure many of you, especially if you are interested in attending the summit, have some sense of this, maybe even have learned this or practiced this, but really recalling, maybe even on a day-to-day basis, that my meaning and purpose in this work is defined by the compassion I'm able to hold for others. And then this really gives us the motivation of, wow, how do I create sustainable empathy? Because this sustainable empathy is the key. It was what transforms our ability to have stress become meaning. So without further ado, I'd like us to move forward and talk a bit about emotions. So all of us are experts in emotion, right? We have emotions every day. We have for our entire life. In fact, our emotions start as early as 3 months old with our first smiles. And we are, operating with a full range of emotions well into 6 months. And by 9 months, we've even learned the invaluable skill of not showing our emotions to others, so masking and suppressing. So emotions are a crucial part of our interaction, our connection, of course, as we are bonding to our mother when we're quite young, and then throughout our life. A basic definition of emotion I think will be helpful is this. Emotion is a process in which we notice and sense that something important to our welfare is occurring. So I'm going to stop there. With emotion, it's a process. So it's not just I feel good and I feel bad. Emotion has a trigger, it has an experience, and it has a response. So emotion is a process that unfolds. And we're not always emotional. We're emotional in response to something important. When I have just a general morning where I get to just write emails, unless there's some really upsetting emails, I'm probably not having a whole lot of emotional responses. So emotion is a process in which we sense that something important to our welfare is occurring, and a set of psychological and physiological changes and behaviors begin to deal with the situation. Now, all that to say is that our emotions are incredibly functional. They arise in response to something important to help us in order to do what we need to do next. And that happens at an embodied level, and that happens at a mental level, and that happens in how we actually respond. So this may already be clear or obvious, but I think you'll see why this definition helps us. When we look at emotions this way, we are then encouraged to think that it's not as though some emotions are good and some emotions are bad, or some emotions are positive, like joy, and others are negative, like anger. In fact, all emotions have some important message for us to understand. Sometimes we respond to emotions in ways that are destructive. Sometimes we respond to emotions in ways that are constructive. And when we talk about developing emotion awareness or emotion regulation or emotion intelligence, we're talking about responding in a more effective and constructive way. We are triggered to an emotion in under 25th of a second. So it's really hard for us to modify or change what triggers us. And emotions are designed to arise outside of our conscious awareness. I want to say that one more time. They are designed to arise outside of our conscious awareness. So I hope that gives you a huge sigh of relief. You're not alone. If you are immediately triggered to emotion, it means you're human. And yet we can learn skills of how do we work with that felt experience. So we've been triggered. How do we work with the experience of our emotion so that we can respond in a constructive way? So a constructive version of anger, for example, could be, I am so frustrated by the electronic health record, right? I hear that a lot. And I am then motivated to get together with some of my colleagues and ask for additional tutoring and help. It's just too complicated. That's a constructive response to anger. A destructive response to that same episode would be kind of ruminating and feeling frustrated. And then the next time you run into a colleague or manager, you just like kind of unload on them. Like, this is such BS. Like, just so over this, this place sucks. Like, it's dysfunctional. And then we feel bad, that other person feels bad, and that's a destructive response. It's not helpful. So that's an important distinction. I next would like to show you a little bit from this Atlas of Emotion projects. So in the Atlas of Emotion, what our goal was is to make visual what's invisible, is our experience of emotion. So what you see here is a slide that shows a range of emotions of anger. Anger is an important emotion and one that we'll work with together here because of its destructive potential. It gets in the way of our ability to communicate effectively and, of course, can lead to conflict. It's also at a low level can create a feeling of just annoyance and frustration and inability to get outside of our own mind. So if we look at this representation here, we see that at a small level, we can be annoyed, and then we could be frustrated. And this could also be fury at its intense level, just rage and overwhelm. And it's important for us to recognize that there's an entire family of anger emotions. Being able to describe specifically what emotion we're feeling actually helps us get some distance from the emotion and may help inform us of what do we need to do to respond effectively. The next thing I'm going to show you here is that there's not only a whole variety of states of emotion, there's also a whole variety of responses to emotion. So here we see fear, and we see that there's many different ways we could respond to fear. We could respond to fear by taking a time out. We could respond to fear by hiding out or escaping. And to be really clear on, okay, what is the state I'm feeling of the emotion and what is my response? That gives us some good data on how to work with specific emotions. Now, I want us to focus a little bit more on anger. As I said, anger ends up being an emotion that comes up a lot across industries. It's not just healthcare, but doing a lot of work in healthcare as I have, it's one I've worked with over and over. How to help people understand and investigate their anger, how to put it in perspective. So I want you to think of maybe the last time you were frustrated, annoyed, or angry in the last couple days. And just take a moment or two. And there are some very common triggers to anger. I'll go through just a couple. Some common triggers to anger include injustice. So for an example, not being given credit for work that you had done, or someone saying that you had done something wrong you hadn't, so being wrongly faulted. Another common trigger to anger could be a feeling of disrespect. So a conflict with a colleague who is just not showing you the respect you deserved. This unfortunately happens a lot interprofessionally. And being micromanaged can feel like disrespect. Another common trigger for anger can be a lack of efficacy, like, why is it happening this way? So this includes technology that doesn't work. It includes just massive amounts of paperwork. It includes having too many meetings, not being able to actually do any work. So these are really common triggers to anger, and ones that we will find ourselves confronted with and invited to understand, well, what is it that's happening for me here? What's the message of this emotion, and how might I respond effectively? So one way I'm going to suggest we respond effectively is by looking at this emotional timeline. So as I mentioned briefly, emotions are triggered in a 25th of a second. Mostly they last about 30 to 90 seconds. This is not very long. This is such a short amount of time. So when we are doing emotion timeline or emotion mapping, usually we're doing it retrospectively or reflecting on what happened. So the components of a timeline, as I mentioned before, are the trigger, the experience, and the response. So I'm going to use an example from a pediatric resident about her trigger, experience, and response. It's one that really stuck with me and I think is relatable. So the trigger in this case was she was working the ER as a pediatrician, and there was a patient who was quite sick and needed to be admitted into cardiology. She called the cards team and they said, no, we won't accept her, we're full. And this led to enormous frustration. So the trigger was this cards team saying no. Her experience was enormous feeling of frustration and anger. And her response was she was very aggressive and angry towards this team on the phone. That was her response. So let's look a little deeper here. With trigger, we're thinking about what is the trigger? And with the experience, what emotion was felt? Where was it felt in the body? She described feeling it in the jaw, feeling it in the chest, and that she felt really hot. She said in terms of intensity, it was very intense and very fast. Her response, right, was this kind of, yelling and being quite upset with the team. And she said the entire episode couldn't have been longer than about 1.5 minutes. But let's look a little deeper even still. So this next slide I'm going to show you is one that's on the Atlas of Emotion site. So you'll have time to look at it and investigate if you'd like. It's described in detail. But for now, I'm just going to walk you through. We have the same idea here, trigger, experience, and response. What we see here is the trigger has 3 parts. The precondition. She's been doing nights. She's been doing nights for weeks. And before that, her schedule wasn't good either. So she's exhausted. She's worn down. And most of us don't take into account when we are triggered to an emotion, what was going on for us immediately, or what we walked into. How we are emotional today could be quite different than how we are emotional tomorrow, depending on how hungry we are, right? Or how much sleep we got, or what happened to us earlier in the day. And there's another level here that you see below of the database. So in the case of this resident, she said that this wasn't the first time she'd had conflict with the cards team. She had a kind of idea or working idea about who they were and how they responded to her. For her, there was a trigger there of disrespect, and that she felt they weren't listening and they didn't care. They maybe thought they were better than her. Now, even if she hadn't worked with this team, all of us have these triggers that are accumulation of our life events and histories. We could have a parent we didn't feel respected us, or a teacher, or a partner. So we have this database, meaning we have these past stored experiences that help us appraise and perceive the world, effectively acting as mental shortcuts. But sometimes they're wrong. And sometimes they really intensify how we respond. So here we had the precondition of being fatigued, and the database of having a history of feeling disrespect lead to the intensity of her emotional response. She would describe her emotional response as one that was destructive. And it was destructive. I had a little back and forth with her because they did admit the patient. So her anger did in some ways get the outcome that was helpful, but it was destructive mostly because she felt this incredible spiral of shame and guilt for not just hours after, but she reports saying it was days and weeks where she just couldn't believe she'd lost it and felt super unprofessional. And it really made her question herself. So this is the way in which, emotions can really quickly take over. And with this episode and with this tracking, we can start to look for patterns. What is going on when I'm becoming emotionally triggered, especially with anger, in a way that's destructive? Are there patterns? What was going on in the precondition? What's going on in my database? And this may include, intensive psychotherapy. This may include talking with friends in terms of the investigation piece. This timeline is something I've used with, I guess now probably hundreds of healthcare professionals and thousands of other people. And it's a universal tool. And when you use it with others, you really get the added benefit of knowing you're not alone. This is especially important for trainees, but important for all of us in healthcare. Next, I want to share with you a little bit of data from a study I did in which I asked residents across departments twice a day to describe their emotions. They answered some other questions as well, like how tired they were, if they felt connected to patients and colleagues. And I asked them to let me know what was the emotion they most recently felt, what triggered it, how did it feel, how did they respond? That should be familiar to you by now. So I did this study 3 times and got 100 residents, which for those of you who know about residents, it's quite a feat in and of itself. It's really hard to capture their attention. They're incredibly overworked. And before I gave them this app, I also gave them kind of a baseline set of surveys. And these baseline surveys demonstrated what wasn't surprising to me, very high levels of burnout. But the high levels of burnout were especially in emotional exhaustion, as we talked about earlier, and in depersonalization, that cynicism. What was surprising to me is even with this exhaustion and this depersonalization, they still had pretty high levels of efficacy. They felt like what they did made a difference. And that's important. I think otherwise they wouldn't be able to make it through. They had high stress on the perceived stress scale. When they rated their daily emotions, said generally speaking, they rated having pretty high negative emotions and pretty normative or average positive emotions. This really fits the national picture of stress for trainees in healthcare. A little bit higher, given that it was UCSF, which is an R1 hospital, a teaching hospital, there's a bit more intensity there. So after getting these 100 participants to fill out their emotion they were feeling at that moment, which is called ecological momentary assessment, I then looked at, well, what are the emotions that are most common? I imagine you all have guesses. What's the most common emotion on a day-to-day basis for a very stressed out group of people? And I was really surprised. Across the board, evenly distributed, 50% of all the emotions experienced were enjoyment, some form of happiness. And this wasn't just kind of a checked out happiness. On the level of intensity, it was the same intensity as any other emotion, well above the mid-range. And the feeling of enjoyment was often more like peaceful and less like ecstatic. The runners-up were fear, which was about 16% of all emotions reported, and anger, which was 14% of all emotions reported. And you see here in this slide the different kinds of anger. So the more common anger was feeling annoyed, and the more common fear was feeling anxious. The most common of the 50% of happiness was peaceful. We also had, of course, sadness, but that was a little bit less, only 10% of all the emotions reported. What I find to be in some ways the most interesting was how people describe the triggers to their emotion. And this is so important for considering how do we help people. So I had people fill in their responses to emotion so I could get a sense of, well, what was triggering this? And just sharing a little bit here, from anger, what made people feel frustrated, 30% of the time it had to do with themselves or someone close to them. So someone close to them was about 20% of the time. So a personal concern would be something like, I lost my sunglasses and I had a meltdown, right? So that just feeling of frustration and taking it out on yourself. And the social stress would be, my boyfriend was drunk, or I'm not feeling appreciated. There, of course, was frustration from work as well, finding one of your attendings obnoxious. But when we look at fear, it's so much more focused around work stress. So the triggers are too much to do, pressure to see patients and write notes. And the other sources of stress, of course, are personal, speaking to a large group, or other things happening in life. And then when we look at sadness, it's split a bit more. Our own personal issue, like it's an anniversary of their father's death, made one of the respondents sad. And work-related stress, working the night and not having time to socialize, or a tough social situation with the family. So here we're able to see at a kind of granular level, not just these are burnt out residents, right? We know that. What is it that on a day-to-day basis is creating stress for them? The other thing I looked at, of course, was what made them happy. And it was interesting to see that a lot of their enjoyment was around well-being, that they had time for themselves. They don't have much time for it, but I love this one. I worked out, I cooked lunch, I put on an outfit, made me feel good, and I listened to Bob Marley. That's pretty good. And then there's work satisfaction, helping a co-intern finish up some work. And also, of course, things happening in your personal life. So what I think is, really important here in looking at this data is that we need to understand more about the daily experience of emotion. My important point I like to make as often as possible is stress is an over-arousal of emotion. So if you really want to work with stress, you have to work with understanding your emotions. Emotions become over-aroused when they're very intense, when they're very frequent, and when we're trying to avoid them. So if we can bring some awareness and attention to our emotions, we'll get a lot more information about our stress. So just basically, the emotion strategies that are most common to work with, how do we work with these timelines? How do we work with our emotion? Is emotion awareness. So this is being able to recognize what's called the spark before the flame. This idea is that we can recognize before we respond destructively that we've become emotional. There's emotion granularity. I mentioned this earlier, being able to specifically identify exactly what you're feeling as a way to create space from the experience, which can feel all-encompassing, and what has actually occurred. So this granularity has been studied to help us with depression and even aggression, if we're able to just be specific and name the emotion. And then emotional intelligence, and this is a term I'm sure most of you have heard of, and it encompasses a lot of these other skills of granularity and awareness, but it also really focuses on the ability to monitor your own emotions and others' emotions, and then use that as a way to guide behavior. So now I want to transition for the remainder of our time to talk a little bit about interventions. So I was really fortunate during my postdoc at the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine to have the time and space over 3 years to do an assessment, to do an adaptation of training, and to pilot across departments. So for my pre-assessment, I was able to do interviews and focus groups, not only with residents and faculty, but also with patient families. This was enormously important. If you're thinking about starting a well-being program inside of your department, I really recommend doing this initial phase of gathering ideas and information. You might also find what's already working, not just what's hard, but what's also used, and you can incorporate that. I then adapted largely cultivating emotional balance. So this training based in emotion regulation, compassion practices, attention practices, but made it useful for residents. As I mentioned, this is like, a really hard audience, and it was a really good practice for me. What I realized is, even though I like to meditate, I lead meditation retreats, I practice myself, this wasn't always the best intervention for them. Now, I hesitate to say this. I know that there's so much wonderful research supporting meditation and mindfulness. I do think when you are underslept, when you are persistently being evaluated for whether or not you're doing something right, and you close your eyes and you try to clear your head of thoughts for 20 minutes, it can be enormously agitating. You can feel unsuccessful and resentful. What I found for these residents, and even for faculty, is really brief meditation. Meditation you can do in going up the elevator from the bottom floor to the ICU, and really utilizing the live time you have together to build social support. And not in a venting session, which can unfortunately lead to cynicism, but in structured ways of sharing emotional experiences and coping strategies, using the timeline to talk about fear, anger, shame. Shame, guilt, and contempt are ones that I think are pretty insidious. We don't notice them, and ones that are really helpful to share with others. And I was able to do this pilot in family and community medicine, internal medicine, pediatrics, and back to my home department in the emergency room. And I'm continuing to do this work with faculty there who are instructing residents, and with some residents directly. Now, the way that I organized this training was that each session had, again, these brief guided meditations, a little bit of didactic material on emotions, a group discussion, and an opening and closing. So we could do this in 45 minutes. Ideally, we had an hour, hour and a half. Sometimes I did this once a month. Sometimes I would do a 4-hour block and not see people for months. I worked within what was available for the schedule. And again, it was a wonderful training ground for me to figure out, how do these mindfulness and compassion-based interventions best work for healthcare settings? So I'm delighted to share with you the news that we will be starting our very first Greater Good Center Institute for Healthcare Providers. This will be a 3-day immersive in which we are really focusing on building a sense of meaning and purpose in healthcare, building personal resilience and emotional awareness, and then strengthening communication and connection to others. This will be in October. You see the information here. And we'll also, for those who can't make it, it's going to be a small group training where we only have space for about 70 people. So we'll do something available for far more people as a 12-month, like I was describing earlier. And each month we'll focus on one practice, whether it's forgiveness, working with anger, gratitude, savoring. And we'll give you all the tools you need to practice with other people. This is the thing I need to emphasize over and over. I love online training. And if you're doing practices, it's great to have even just one other person to do this with. So the 12-month training will be set up for people to do in small groups. And if you want even more, we'll have a more intensive training where you will learn how to teach this to others. So I'd like to close my time with you by telling you about something that's already available. We have a wonderful resource online that's called Gratitude as Medicine. So not just gratitude in medicine, but gratitude as medicine. And if you Google this very simple title, as you see here, what you'll get is the slides I'm going to show you, a full PowerPoint deck that describes how gratitude can help us. And overall, gratitude increases happiness. It helps people be more resilient to stress, helps them get along better with others and feel less depressed. It's even said that grateful people achieve more, for all you overachievers. But specifically, it's really interesting to see that there's benefits of gratitude in health. It improves our sleep and our desire to exercise. It improves our overall optimism and reduces substance use, fat intake, cortisol, blood pressure. It's pretty incredible, the benefits of this very simple practice. And one thing I think is really nice to consider is we can use gratitude to help us with our relationship with our colleagues. So when we appreciate other colleagues, we feel more connected to them. And when we feel gratitude, we can also notice the good that our colleagues are doing, having this sense of elevation, watching our colleague be present and compassionate to another patient. And we can really take that in. There is, according to my data and according to a lot of other theory, there's a lot of opportunities to see and witness positive emotions and to take the time to let that soak in and to really harvest that joy. There's also a way in which gratitude can motivate our sense of humility. We feel so, aware that our capacity and our power is limited, right? And we're grateful for what we can do. And we also can really call upon this sense of indebtedness and purpose. Wow, I'm here today because of so many different people and discoveries and ideas that allowed me to be here. There's a lot of ways that a specific gratitude practice can help. So I'd like to invite you that after you watch this session to do a sharing of gratitude. It's a simple practice. It's some description here. You just find a photo on your phone and one that makes you feel gratitude. It feels a real appreciation. And with someone else, this could be a colleague or a family member, really describe in detail what you're grateful for about this, what specifically, and how that makes you feel. If it's someone in particular, you can send them a text after and just reflect on this simple practice. You see here a photo of my cat and my surfboard. Specifically, I feel great gratitude for my cat who reminds me how to relax, how to really just sleep and feel connected to my own self and my own needs. And surfing makes me feel connected to the planet and really motivated to sustain and support the environmental protection of this planet. So not just surfing like, oh, it's so fun, but like the deeper level of what these activities can create in us. So it's just been such a delight to be here with you all today. And I'd love to hear from you about how these practices resonate to you or how you'd like to use them. And please come to our website. We have tons of more practices available for you freely and find out about the Institute. I hope to see you all soon.